Before we dive in, I want to share a story that perfectly illustrates how financial incompatibility can destroy even the most promising relationships. This is about recognizing red flags before they cost you everything. Let's get into it. My fiancé demanded a massive wedding loan and called me cheap when I refused. And that's when everything started to fall apart. I'm talking about a woman who I thought understood me, who told me she loved my simple life, who said she was done with all the materialistic chaos of the city. But looking back now, I realized she was never really happy with what I had to offer, and I was just too blind to see it. Let me take you back to where this whole thing started. Because the warning signs were there from day one, I just chose to ignore them. I grew up in a small town where people didn't flash their money around, where your word meant something, and where nobody thought twice about driving a 10-year-old truck if it still ran fine. My parents taught me to save, to live within my means, and to never put myself in debt for things I didn't absolutely need. I worked in it, made decent money, had a nice chunk saved up in the bank, and, honestly, I was content with my life. I had a small house that I owned outright, no car payments, no credit card debt, nothing hanging over my head. Some people might call it boring, but I called it freedom. Then I met Lauren at a party my buddy Ethan threw one summer evening. She walked in wearing this gorgeous dress, all confidence and style, completely out of place in Ethan's backyard, where everyone else was in jeans and t-shirts. She was from the city, worked in marketing, and had this energy about her that just pulled you in. We got to talking, and she told me she was tired of the rat race, exhausted from keeping up with everyone's expectations. And she said my calm, grounded approach to life was refreshing. She actually used that word, refreshing, like I was some kind of cold drink on a hot day. We started dating, and for the first few months, everything felt perfect. She'd drive out to visit me on weekends. We'd have coffee on my porch in the mornings, go fishing at the lake, cook dinner together, and just enjoy the quiet. She laughed at herself when she couldn't bait a hook properly. Said she loved how different my world was from hers and kept telling me how lucky she felt to have found someone who wasn't obsessed with status and appearances. I remember one night we were sitting under the stars, and she looked at me with these soft eyes and said she finally felt like she could breathe. That's the moment I felt completely for her. The moment I thought I'd found someone who truly got me. But then little things started happening. Small comments here and there that I brushed off at the time. She'd joke about my truck being older than some of her friends' kids. Make little remarks about how we should upgrade to a nicer restaurant instead of the local diner, or mention how her friends back in the city had these amazing apartments with skyline views. At first, I thought she was just making conversation, comparing our lives in a harmless way. But the frequency started increasing. She'd scroll through social media and show me engagement rings her friends got huge diamonds that cost more than my truck. And she'd laugh and say something like, "Can you imagine spending that much on a ring?" But there was always this look in her eyes, this little flicker of want that I tried to ignore. She started talking about her old life more often, the fancy dinners, the weekend getaways, the designer clothes she used to buy without thinking twice. She'd always follow it up with, "But I don't miss any of that," which should have been my first real clue that maybe she did miss it, maybe more than she wanted to admit. About 8 months into our relationship, I decided I wanted to marry her. I'd been saving money my whole adult life, and I had enough to buy a beautiful sapphire engagement ring, her favorite gemstone set in white gold with small accent stones around it. It wasn't a massive diamond, but it was elegant, unique, and I thought it represented us perfectly. I proposed to her on the same porch where we'd spent so many quiet mornings. At sunrise with coffee getting cold beside us because we were too caught up in the moment. She said yes. She cried happy tears. And for that first week, everything felt like a dream come true. Then came the moment that should have made me pause and really think about what I was getting into. We drove to her parents' house the following weekend so I could officially ask for their blessing even though we were already engaged and so she could show off the ring. The whole drive there, she seemed nervous, fidgeting with the ring box, checking her makeup in the mirror more than usual, and barely talking. When we arrived, her mom opened the door with this huge smile, pulled Lauren into a hug, and immediately grabbed her hand to see the ring. I watched her mom's face change in real time, watched the smile falter just slightly, watched her eyes flick to mine with this look I couldn't quite read. Her dad was more subtle about it, gave me a firm handshake, said congratulations. But I could feel the judgment in the air. Her mom made some comment about sapphires being interesting choices with way too much enthusiasm, the kind of tone people use when they're trying really hard to be polite about something they don't actually like. Lauren barely showed the ring to anyone else that day, kept her hand in her lap during dinner, and didn't post any photos like I thought she would. The drive home was quiet, uncomfortably quiet. And when I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said she was tired. But I saw the way she looked at that ring when she thought I wasn't watching. The way she twisted it around her finger like she was trying to imagine it being something else. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for weeks. That was the first time I wondered if she was embarrassed of what I gave her. If maybe the woman who said she loved my simple life was actually just waiting for me to become someone different, someone who could give her the life she'd left behind. Now, here's what I should have recognized back then but didn't want to see. When someone tells you they've left behind a lifestyle, watch how they talk about it. Lauren never said she disagreed with materialism or that she'd learned it was empty. She just said she was tired. That's not the same as changed. Tired means you want a break, not that you fundamentally shifted your values. And when her mom made that comment about the ring being an interesting choice, that wasn't really about the sapphire at all. That was about me not meeting their financial expectations. I was being evaluated like a business investment, and I'd already failed the first assessment. The question I should have asked myself right then was this: if she's embarrassed to show her family what I gave her, how is she going to feel showing her friends, her coworkers, the rest of her world? But I didn't ask that question because I was in love. And love has a way of making you ignore the obvious until it's too late. Have you ever stayed in a relationship where you knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite admit it to yourself yet? The foundation was already cracked before the proposal even happened. When someone consistently compares your life unfavorably to their past, they're telling you exactly what they still want, and it's not what you're offering. The wedding planning started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself when Lauren suggested we sit down and make a guest list. I was thinking maybe 50 people, close family and friends, something intimate where we could actually talk to everyone and enjoy the day. She pulled out her laptop and started typing names. And I watched that list grow from 50 to 75 to 100. And she just kept going. When I asked why we needed so many people, she looked at me like I'd asked why we needed oxygen and said it would be rude not to invite her entire extended family, all her work colleagues, her college friends, and obviously everyone from her parents' social circle. I did the math in my head and realized we were looking at over 200 guests. And suddenly, this intimate celebration I'd imagined turned into something that felt more like a corporate event. She started talking about venues, showing me pictures of vineyards and historic mansions and waterfront properties that required a year-long waiting list just to book. Every single option came with a price tag that made my stomach turn. But whenever I brought up the cost, she'd wave it off and say we'd figure it out. That weddings were expensive for everyone, that this was normal. I suggested we look at something simpler. Maybe the community center where Ethan's sister had her wedding, or even an outdoor ceremony at the lake. But Lauren's face would cloud over, and she'd get this tight smile that told me I'd said the wrong thing. She started using phrases like our special day and once in a lifetime whenever I questioned a cost. Like those magic words justified any amount of spending. The catering became our first real fight. I found a great local caterer who did buffet-style service, really good food, reasonable prices, and they had excellent reviews from people in town. Lauren looked at the proposal for maybe 30 seconds before pushing it aside and pulling up websites for premium catering companies that did plated meals with multiple courses and wine pairings. The difference in cost was staggering. We were talking about tripling our food budget, but she insisted that buffets looked cheap and tacky, that her family would judge us, that we couldn't ask people to stand in line at our own wedding. I tried to explain that most of our guests wouldn't care, that they'd be happy just to celebrate with us, but she'd already moved on to talking about hiring a live band instead of a DJ. Every conversation about the wedding turned into a negotiation where I was apparently being unreasonable for wanting to stay within a budget. And she was just trying to make sure we didn't embarrass ourselves in front of everyone we knew. I started dreading these planning sessions. Started feeling this knot in my chest every time she said we needed to talk about wedding stuff because I knew it meant another conversation about spending money we didn't have on things that didn't matter to me. Then one night, I couldn't sleep and I grabbed her laptop to check my email because my phone was charging in the other room. The browser was still open to her last search and I saw the tabs. She'd been Googling how to upgrade an engagement ring, looking at diamond replacements, scrolling through before and after photos of rings that had been fixed with bigger center stones. I just sat there in the dark staring at that screen, feeling something break inside my chest. She'd never said a word to me about being unhappy with the ring. Never mentioned wanting something different, but here was the evidence that she'd been thinking about it, probably since the day I proposed. I closed the laptop and lay back down, and I couldn't stop thinking about all the times she'd angled her hand away when taking photos, all the times she'd kept it in her pocket during family gatherings, all the little signs I'd missed or chosen to ignore. That was the moment I realized she'd never really been happy with what I offered. She'd just been waiting for me to figure out I needed to offer more. The bridesmaid situation pushed things even further. Lauren wanted her sister Hannah and 3 friends from college to be in the wedding party, which seemed fine until she announced they'd all need to buy matching dresses from a specific boutique. These weren't regular dresses you could find on sale or wear again. These were custom-ordered bridesmaid gowns that cost several hundred each, plus alterations, plus the shoes she'd picked out to match. Hannah called me one afternoon, her voice tight with stress, and told me she was having trouble affording everything Lauren wanted. She had 2 kids, a mortgage, a tight budget, and she'd already tried talking to Lauren about finding more affordable options. But Lauren had shut her down completely and told her she was being unsupportive. Hannah said she was calling me because she was hoping maybe I could get through to Lauren in a way she couldn't, that maybe Lauren would listen to her future husband even if she wouldn't listen to her own sister. When I brought it up that evening, Lauren's response made my blood run cold. She said if people couldn't afford to be in her wedding, maybe they weren't the right people to have standing beside her, that real friends would find a way to make it work, that this was her one chance to have everything perfect. And she wasn't going to compromise because other people had financial problems. I stared at the woman sitting across from me and genuinely didn't recognize her anymore. This wasn't the person who'd sat on my porch and talked about how exhausting it was to keep up with everyone's expectations. This was someone who was now creating those exact same expectations for everyone around her. The breaking point came when she started talking about her bachelorette party. Her friends wanted to do a weekend in Miami clubs and beaches and bottle service, and they were expecting all the bridesmaids to chip in for Lauren's expenses on top of their own. We were talking about flights, hotels, party packages, the kind of weekend that would cost each person well over $1,000. Hannah called me again, practically in tears this time, saying she couldn't afford it, but Lauren was making her feel guilty for even hesitating, posting things in the bridesmaids group chat about how this was supposed to be a celebration of sisterhood. And she was hurt that not everyone was as excited as she was. I finally sat Lauren down and told her we needed to have a serious conversation about money, about expectations, about what we could actually afford versus what she wanted. That's when she brought up the loan. She'd already researched it, already looked into wedding loans, and calculated how much we could borrow based on my income. And she presented it to me like it was the obvious solution to all our problems. She said everyone took out loans for their weddings, that we'd pay it back over time, that the monthly payments wouldn't be that bad if we just adjusted our lifestyle a little bit. I felt like the walls were closing in, like I was being backed into a corner with no way out. I told her no. Told her I wouldn't start our marriage buried in debt for one day. Wouldn't sacrifice our future for a party. That's when she called me cheap. Said I was selfish and small-minded. Asked me if I even loved her because if I did, I want to give her the wedding she deserved. She said I was embarrassing her in front of her family, that everyone could see I wasn't willing to provide for her, that maybe she'd made a mistake thinking I was the kind of man who could make her happy. Those words hung in the air between us, and I realized this wasn't about a wedding anymore. This was about who we fundamentally were as people, and we were not the same. Let me break down what was really happening here, because this is where the manipulation reached its peak. Lauren had spent months slowly escalating her demands, testing my boundaries, seeing how far she could push before I'd push back. Every time I agreed to something bigger or more expensive, it reset her baseline for what was acceptable. The guest list grew because I didn't fight hard enough when it hit 100. The venue got more elaborate because I'd already compromised on the catering. The bridesmaids' dresses became non-negotiable because I'd let everything else slide. This is how financial abuse works in relationships. It's not one big demand. It's 1,000 small concessions that add up to you losing yourself completely. And that accusation that I didn't love her enough, that's the nuclear option of emotional manipulation. She was weaponizing my feelings for her, trying to make me prove my love by destroying my financial stability. The cruelest part was that she'd specifically sought out someone with my values, someone stable and debt-free, because that made me a good provider. But now those same values were being reframed as character flaws. What's the biggest financial mistake you've ever almost made for someone else? This is textbook escalation tactics. Each compromise becomes the new baseline, and suddenly you're defending boundaries you never imagined needing to defend. When love becomes conditional on spending, it was never really love. A few days later, she told me her parents wanted to have us over for dinner. Said it was just a casual family meal, nothing formal, but I knew better. I could feel it in my gut that this wasn't going to be casual anything. I showed up to that dinner knowing exactly what was coming. But nothing really prepares you for sitting at a table while 3 people tag team you about your financial decisions. Lauren's dad started it off smooth, talking about how weddings were investments in your future, how the connections you made and the impression you left could open doors down the road. How successful people understood that sometimes you had to spend money to show people you were worth knowing. Her mom jumped in with stories about weddings she'd attended. How the modest ones were always remembered as the sad ones. How nobody forgot a beautiful celebration, but everyone forgot a cheap one. Lauren sat there quiet, letting them do the work, occasionally nodding like they were making excellent points she'd never thought of before. They had charts, actual printed charts showing average wedding costs in our region, payment plans for loans, even contact information for a loan officer her dad apparently played golf with. I felt like I was in a business presentation about my own life, except the product they were selling was debt and disappointment. Her dad looked me straight in the eye and said I needed to think about what kind of man I wanted to be. Whether I was the kind who stepped up for his family or the kind who let them down when it mattered. That's when something shifted inside me. When I realized this wasn't about love or commitment or building a life together. This was about control and keeping up appearances and funding a fantasy that had nothing to do with me. I set down my fork, looked at Lauren, and waited for her to say something, to defend me, to tell her parents that we'd figure this out together as a couple. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Just kept staring at her plate like the pattern on the china was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. So I said the thing I'd been holding back for weeks because I kept hoping we'd find our way back to those quiet mornings on the porch. I told them I wouldn't sacrifice my future for one day, that I'd work too hard to build a stable life to throw it away on a party, that if Lauren needed me to go into debt to prove I loved her, then maybe we wanted different things out of this marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence where you can hear people's brains recalculating everything they thought they knew. Lauren's face went red, then white, and she finally looked at me with eyes full of anger instead of love. Her dad started to say something about me being unreasonable, but I was already standing up, already thanking them for dinner, already walking toward the door. Lauren followed me outside, and we stood in her parents' driveway under the porch light while moths circled above us. And she told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I told her I was pretty sure marrying someone who valued a wedding more than a marriage was the bigger mistake. And then I got in my truck and drove away. The next few weeks were brutal in ways I didn't expect. Lauren told everyone who would listen that I was cheap and controlling, that I promised her a beautiful wedding and then backed out when it came time to actually pay for it, that she'd wasted 2 years of her life on someone who didn't value her. Her version of events spread through her social circle like wildfire. And suddenly, I was getting messages from people I barely knew telling me what a terrible person I was. Ethan told me to ignore it. Said anyone who actually knew me would see through it. But it still stung to have my name dragged through the mud by someone who told me she loved me just weeks before. I threw myself into work, started going to the gym more, spent time with friends who didn't ask me every 5 minutes if I was okay. And then about a month after our breakup, I heard through Hannah that Lauren had started dating someone new, a lawyer named Daniel, who apparently had money and wasn't afraid to spend it. Part of me felt relieved that she'd moved on so quickly that maybe now the drama would finally die down and I could start rebuilding my life in peace. But Lauren being Lauren, moving on quietly wasn't really her style. She posted photos constantly, designer bags and fancy restaurants and weekend trips to places I'd never heard of. Always with captions about finally being treated the way she deserved. Daniel seemed nice enough from what I could see. Always smiling in photos. Always dressed sharp. The kind of guy who looked like he walked out of a cologne advertisement. I stopped checking her social media after a while because it felt like watching a performance that had nothing to do with real life. But I'd still hear updates from mutual friends who couldn't help themselves from filling me in. Apparently, Lauren was already talking about wedding plans again, already looking at venues and showing off a new engagement ring that made her sapphire look like a toy from a vending machine. Friends told me she was pushing Daniel even harder than she'd pushed me. That every conversation was about the wedding, about what she wanted, about making sure everything was absolutely perfect this time. I almost felt bad for the guy, almost wanted to warn him about what he was getting into. But I figured he was a lawyer and probably smart enough to figure it out on his own. Then one Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after I'd walked away from Lauren, I ran into Megan at the grocery store. She'd been one of Lauren's bridesmaids, and we'd always gotten along fine during the planning phase. She looked genuinely happy to see me, which was surprising given how Lauren had been talking about me, and she suggested we grab coffee. We sat down at a cafe near the store, and she told me she'd felt terrible about how everything went down, that she'd never really believed Lauren's version of events, and honestly, she just needed to vent to someone who'd understand what Lauren was really like. Megan told me everything. Told me things I never would have known otherwise. Lauren had pushed Daniel to book the most expensive venue in the entire region. Insisted on a guest list even bigger than the one she'd wanted with me. Demanded a ring upgrade just months after he proposed because the first one wasn't quite right. The bridesmaids were all stressed about costs again. Lauren had picked even more expensive dresses this time, and the bachelorette party was now planned for the Bahamas instead of Miami. But here's the thing that made my coffee taste better than it had any right to. Daniel had started asking questions, started pushing back, started realizing that maybe this wedding wasn't about building a life together, but about putting on a show. 2 weeks before they were supposed to send out invitations, he called the whole thing off, told Lauren he couldn't marry someone who cared more about the wedding than the marriage, and ended their relationship entirely. Megan said Lauren was devastated, not because she'd lost Daniel, but because she'd lost the wedding, lost the chance to prove to everyone that she could have the perfect day she'd always wanted. I wish I could say I felt nothing when I heard that I was completely over it and didn't care what happened to her anymore. But the truth is I felt vindicated, felt like the universe had confirmed what I'd known all along, that I'd made the right choice walking away when I did. A few months later, I made a decision I'd been thinking about for a while. I sold my small house and put a down payment on a bigger place. A real house with land and a view and room to grow. The kind of property I'd always dreamed about but never bought because I was saving for a future that turned out to be an illusion. I started dating again eventually. Nothing serious at first. Just coffee and conversations with people who didn't measure my worth by my willingness to go into debt. Life got quieter, simpler, better in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or proving anything to anyone. And sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that moment on her parents' driveway about walking away from someone I thought I'd spend my life with. And I'd feel grateful instead of sad. Here's what I learned from all of this, and I hope it helps someone else who might be in a similar situation. Love shouldn't come with a price tag. And the person who truly wants to build a life with you will care more about the life you're building than the party you throw to announce it. When someone shows you who they really are, especially when it comes to money and values, believe them. The first time. Those little comments Lauren made about my truck, about my house, about wanting better restaurants, those weren't jokes or harmless observations. Those were her real feelings leaking out before she'd perfected the act. And when someone uses love as leverage to get what they want. When they tell you that proving your love requires you to damage yourself financially or emotionally, that's not love at all. That's control wearing a romantic disguise. I didn't lose a fiancé that night in her parents' driveway. I escaped a future I would have regretted forever. I escaped years of debt, years of feeling like I was never enough. Years of watching my hard-earned savings disappear into someone else's fantasy while my own dreams collected dust. The wedding she wanted would have lasted one day, but the debt would have lasted years, and the resentment would have lasted even longer. Sometimes the best decision you can make is the one that disappoints everyone else, but saves yourself. What would you do if someone you loved asked you to compromise everything you'd worked for? The real lesson here isn't about weddings or money. It's about recognizing when someone's vision of the future fundamentally conflicts with yours. Financial values aren't just preferences. They're core beliefs about security, priorities, and what kind of life you want to build together. When those don't align, no amount of love can bridge that gap. What do you think about the story? Let me know in the comments. Drop a like and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.